Okay, I'm going to propose that we get going because we have a lot to talk about this evening. So welcome everyone. We are totally delighted that you are here with us this evening to have this wonderful conversation about the lives of Amish women with Karen Johnson-Weiner. I'm really looking forward to this. I've had the opportunity over the years to have many conversations with Karen on the subject, but I learn something new every time I have the opportunity to talk with her about this. So I'm very pleased that she's here with us this evening. I am Jill Bright. I'm the Executive Director of Tawny, and I don't want to use any of Karen's time talking about Tawny and what we do. So if you are new to us, you will see in the chat that we have some information about how to be in touch with us and how to learn more about us. And we hope that you will do that and that you will get involved with us and participate in other activities that we have coming up. And we'll be happy to follow up with you later if you have any questions about Tawny in particular. I also would like to introduce my co-host for the evening, Shuka Wei. Shuka, are you waving? Yes, Shuka is waving to you. Shuka Wei is the Communications Director at Tawny, and she's co-hosting with me this evening. So she's gonna help make sure that we get your questions answered. And if you have any technical difficulties over the course of the evening, you can send a message to Shuka in the chat and she'll be watching that and she can help you out. So thank you, Shuka, and I'm glad you're here with me tonight co-hosting. That's wonderful. So let me just briefly cover a few housekeeping things. As I've said a couple of times, everybody is muted right now. We probably all have enough experience with Zoom to understand why that is so. But there will be an opportunity later in the evening to unmute yourself and speak directly to Karen if you choose to. In the meantime, please use the chat for your questions. We'll be monitoring the chat all evening and you can put any questions that you have in the chat. We will take your questions sort of in the order that they make sense for what we're talking about and what topic we're covering. At the moment, we've sort of loosely designed an architecture for the evening that involves kind of going through the stages of a woman's life. So we'll try to match your questions up with the appropriate time. We're shooting for about an hour long, but if you want to stay longer and you have more questions, we're very happy to have that be the case. This is going to be a very casual back and forth question and answer kind of event. We did receive a number of questions in advance, and I just want to say to those of you who sent your questions in advance, thank you. And again, we've kind of keyed those to particular stages of a woman's life, and we'll address those questions when we get there. So don't worry if we don't get to your questions right away, we will be getting to them. So I think that's all I have to say, other than to say that, you know, again, we are really focusing on the lives of Amish women this evening. And if you have questions about Amish culture in general, we'll get to those if we have time at the end. And if we don't get to them, we certainly have opportunities after this event to get you answers for those questions. But we're going to really prioritize the questions this evening that relate to women's lives. So with that said, I'm going to introduce Karen. So Karen Johnson-Weiner is a distinguished service professor of anthropology emerita at SUNY Potsdam in Potsdam, New York, where she taught courses in linguistic anthropology. She received her Ph.D. in linguistics from McGill University in 1984. And actually her interest in language is, as you'll learn in a moment, really what led her to her study of Amish culture. She's been studying patterns of language use and cultural maintenance in Amish and Mennonite communities for over 30 years. And I'm thinking it's maybe even creeping up closer to 40. I don't know.
Right. You're absolutely right. It's been over 36 years.
36 years, okay. Karen is one of really just a very few top scholars of Amish culture in the world. And she is recognized as the world authority scholar, however you choose to look at that. She is recognized as the world authority on Schwarzentruber Amish culture in particular, which is an area that she has really spent a lot of her life exploring. She's written a number of books and many, many articles. She's done a lot of public programs. She's been very instrumental in facilitating understanding of Amish culture with the larger community around Amish settlements. I don't know if any of you have seen the PBS American Experience program about the Amish, but that program is connected to a book called The Amish that Karen was a co-author on. So she's got many things to her credit that I could go on about, but I think you probably get the idea. And I have to say also, very importantly to me, Karen serves on the Tawny Board of Directors. And when Tawny opened its first public gallery in Canton in 1994, Karen was one of the very first people to come visit our gallery. And she's been visiting steadily ever since and has been very involved with Tawny over the years. So I'm grateful to her for that as well. So thank you, Karen. And we're really happy to have you here tonight.
Thank you, Jill. I'm happy to be here.
So I mentioned your publications, and speaking of publications, let's just bring up a little slide here for a moment. So Karen has more publications than these three to her credit, but these are the three I'm going to mention because we have them available to sell to you should you be interested. So the one in the middle, The Lives of Amish Women, is the one that we are really going to be focused on talking about this evening. That book is available. And again, there's information in the chat about how to go to our online store and purchase it if you'd like. We are offering a 25% off price on that particular book this evening because, well, that's what we're focused on this evening. We thought that would be a nice thing to do. But I want to at least mention the other two books. New York Amish, if you're just curious about what's going on in New York State in general, in terms of groups of Amish, different types of Amish communities moving in, this is your primer for that. And I really recommend that. It's ever changing. You'll notice this is the second edition. And you'll hear in just a moment more from Karen about the fact that that is ever changing. And the book that's come out the most recently on the right, All About the Amish, just came out a few weeks ago. And that I've gone through it. And I have to say that is a terrific introductory guide to the Amish. And even if you think you know a lot about the Amish, actually there's information there that will be helpful. I really recommend that as a reference book to keep on your own library shelf. And also it would make a great gift, I think, for somebody moving into our North Country where they're wondering about the Amish. So I recommend that as well. And all of these books are signed. Karen has come in and she signed all these books, so you get an autographed copy if you purchase one of those. And did you want to say anything about these, Karen, before we dive into the main subject of the evening?
Well, they're all very different. New York Amish, I actually wrote while I was working with two other folks, Don Crable and Steve Nolt, on the Amish. And the opportunity to focus on New York State was both very difficult and very rewarding. Writing The Lives of Amish Women was different in another way. I find when, the more you start to focus in on one aspect of Amish life, the more complicated the research gets. All About the Amish was just fun to write. I was asked to do a kind of question and answer book. And in writing All About the Amish, I pulled on all the questions that I'd been asked over the years and tried to include them all in that book. So it's a Q&A in print, but all were different, all were fun, and all were challenging in their own way.
Right. And the books we're not showing tonight, you also published a book about Amish schools, and you were a co-author of The Amish, the book I spoke about a few minutes ago, associated with the PBS program.
Right.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay. And if you go to purchase a copy of the book, I want to also mention before we get going that should you be inspired because you're having a lovely time this evening, you'd like to make some sort of a donation, $5 or more towards this evening's event, you can do that from the links Shuka has put in the chat as well. And we will thank you for that and use it for future programs. So thank you. So Karen, why don't we start by talking about how you got into your research with the Amish and how one thing led to another.
Pure chance. We had our first child was a newborn, and we decided that we needed a picnic table. And people said, oh, go out to this Amish guy in Rensselaer Falls. He builds picnic tables. So we drove over. I had my infant son was dressed in a onesie of striped primary colors. And a woman came out, much younger than me, had her baby wearing a dark dress. And she started talking to her husband. And I went, what? Pennsylvania Dutch in New York State. How can that be? And I was hooked. I began reading what I could find on the Amish, which quite frankly wasn't very much. This was in 1984. And managed to finagle introductions to two women in very different communities. I didn't notice the difference between those communities until much, much later. But those two women became incredibly important in my life. One was an older woman living in Norfolk, which is a community with Swiss origins. They're Swiss Amish. And the other was a woman my age living in Rensselaer Falls, and she's Schwarzentruber Amish. And those are radically different groups. Over the years, New York started filling up with other kinds of Amish. Those of you who are in the North Country may have noticed brown buggies around Messina. I had a Schwarzentruber Amish fellow stop by the other day, and he was laughing at how strange those buggies looked. If you go out by Malone, you'll see not only Schwarzentruber Amish along 11B, but you'll see more of those brown buggies, which are Byler Amish. And if you keep going out to Burke, you can stop in at Amish stores and you can reach Amish on cell phones. Those are old order Amish. So the North Country began to fill up, and I began visiting more and more people. My research has been largely what we call participant observation. Now, what that has meant personally is that I spend a lot of time doing dishes. I've helped peel peaches. I've sorted through strawberries. I do a lot of sitting around and drinking coffee and talking to people. I've had to cut my research short at one point because Schwarzentruber Amish don't believe in rubber pants. And holding the baby on my lap, well, it left a rather embarrassing mark. So I had to go home and change. You know, so it really means getting involved as much as I can as an outsider in the lifestyle of the people whose culture I'm attempting to understand. And so that's how it's been. I was aided enormously by my children who played with Amish children. I remember one ongoing game where my daughter and two girls about her age were selling kittens, and they keep selling these kittens over and over to each other. So for me, the early days of Amish research were very much involved with family, and they've continued to be that way. As my kids started school, I began to be interested in Amish schools. As communities have schismed, I began to be interested in how language, how faith came together to define different kinds of communities. And it just went on from there, eventually involving other states and other topics. And there we went.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And really, you develop friendships. That's how it's been. They know that you're there to study them, but they've accepted the terms of that. They're comfortable with it because they trust you. And as somebody who's been observing this for a lot of the 30 plus years, they really think of you as a friend, and there's a mutuality in it. And I think that's an important thing to mention about this, because, you know, that's not always a given in these kinds of fieldwork projects.
Well, they are my friends, which you know, I'm now at what I see as the end of my research life. And I'm still going out, and I'm still, you know, holding babies, and I'm still, you know, drinking a lot of coffee. It doesn't end. When we go on vacation, I'm sending postcards. I have a list with about 30 different families to whom I send postcards. These are friends. They have enriched my life beyond belief.
And I know they feel the same way. I know that when you're away traveling, the Amish who come to visit us here because they're bringing products to sell, or for whatever reason they're coming to visit us, they will express that they miss you when you're not in town. You know, they enjoy those visits too. So
thank you.
All right, so well, let's start talking about some of the specifics then. So we're going to pull up some photographs here, and Karen, you did just now reference the fact that there are different kinds of Amish groups here, the Schwarzentroopers being the most conservative and the group that's been here the longest. But I think as we're going along through these photos, we'll probably have reason to talk about some of those differences as well.
Right.
So
I should note that this book tried to cover a range, the range of Amish women, because women in one kind of community have very little understanding of the lives of women in other kinds of communities.
Yeah. So all of the photographs we're going to be showing you this evening are in the book, Lives of Amish Women. Only in the book, they are in black and white. So by being at the event, you get to see them in full color. And we're starting here with childhood. And one of the things that you say in your book is that Amish girls learn to be Amish women through immersion in Amish life and through being with their elders at all times. So do you want to start by talking about that?
I think you become what your community hopes you will become. And so women are born, or little girls are born, and from the beginning, they are in the midst of family, internalizing what is appropriate for them as girls within their community. Now, the beginning of infancy, there's very little difference between infant girls and infant boys and how they're treated. They're, both in the crib, they're right there with everybody else. They get held by any older children. The 1-year-old will hold the newborn. And it may only be that the little girl has a cap on. And that's not even true in all communities. So initially, their life seems very ungendered, except from the beginning, there are expectations for what they will do, how they will behave, what tasks they will come to take on. And yet, even as I say that, it's not a strictly gendered world. If there are only girls, then they're going to be out helping dad. If there are only boys, they're going to be in helping mom. So, but on the whole, they are expected to do more and more and more as they grow older, and in working with others, in working with older children, older members of the community, they take on more and more of the tasks that they'll be expected to do as adult Amish women. So they sort of move from a periphery into their central role as a female member of the Amish church.
And it happens quite naturally. We have a comment here from someone in the event who is noticing that the dresses on these particular Amish women, particularly the blue dress, seems shorter maybe than some of the dresses we're used to seeing on Amish women here.
Yes, these are not women from around here. You might see something similar to this out in Burke, but you can see there are a number of aspects of this picture that point to differences from either the Amish in Norfolk, let's say, or the Schwarzentrooper Amish. Most notably, the Orange Triangle. You'll see that on Norfolk buggies, but not Schwarzentroopers. Though you will see it on Amish around here that look like Schwarzentroopers, and the only way you can tell them apart is that they've got the Orange Triangle. Newcomers to our region, the Troyer Amish. Their caps are different. An Amish person sees these differences right away. Notice that the strings on the caps of both the young woman and her child aren't tied. That indicates a more progressive group. This group has windscreens on their buggies and sliding doors. All of these things hint at a particular kind of Amish community. And those are giant flashing lights. For any other Amish, it tells them a lot about their church community and a lot about how these Amish might interact with others, including with non-Amish or English. So you've got 3 generations there. Some other things to look at: the mother has sandals, which you don't see very often around here. The little girl has white socks. Again, it's not something you'd see. You wouldn't ever see that on a Schwarzentrooper child.
And what is this group, Karen? What group do these women belong to?
These are a Pennsylvania group. They're not Lancaster County. You can tell that by the caps. They're probably in Western Pennsylvania, a more upscale group. You'll see similar kinds of dress in the Conewango Valley, the progressive Amish that settled out there. You'd see that in parts of Ohio and in Indiana.
We have a question here. How are Amish women involved in the religious education of their children? In other words, do they read the Bible to them and or lead prayer?
They would never lead prayer. Amish faith is not an intellectual faith for the most part. It's a lived faith. And so daily life is governed by the ordinance of the community, which basically is, it outlines the church community's understanding of how to follow Christ's example. Ordinances vary from community to community. Each church district or congregation has its own. So, very, very close church districts can vary a little bit in their ordinance. Ordinances determine how people dress, what kinds of furnishings in the home, how you get around, what kind of work you can do, and so on. Mothers participate in the religious education of their children by essentially modeling the ordinance, modeling the behavior. Only dad would lead prayers at home. Only dad would do scripture reading. Mom would, one of the first things that struck me, maternal participation in this. A mother holds her new child, and I see the question there. This is an all oral tradition. It's all handed down. It's confirmed twice a year, just before communion church. You can't have communion if everybody doesn't agree with the ordinance. But mothers will hold infant children on their laps. There's a silent prayer before every meal and a silent prayer after every meal. And the youngest infant sitting on the mother's lap, the mother will hold their hands together for prayer. And that infant can squirm, it can cry, it can do whatever. The mother does not respond until the prayer is done. And little children, it doesn't take them very long to learn this is the behavior at prayer. They've learned when they go to church and mothers hold the new infants on their laps, that in church services, you've got 3 hours sitting on a backless bench and it's all in German. Those infants learn to behave in church. And that's all, the maternal teaching of what's appropriate, and what the child, it's knowledge the child needs to know to grow up and be Amish.
So related to that, let's move on to the next photograph, because we're talking about a child learning through immersion in the family life and the community life. And I find this particular comparison of drawings quite interesting. So this speaks to worldview at a certain age.
Mm-hmm. We've talked about this in the past. The picture of the kitchen was done by a young girl, and she was maybe 12 or 13. I should note that this young girl now has 13 children. So she grew up in this world, she remains in this world. Coloring for me is really a metaphor for Amish life, that you learn early what the lines are. You learn that the lines are important. You learn to stay within the lines, and you learn to be real about what life is. So in coloring, notice how carefully that's colored. There's just no scribbling in the coloring book. This girl's brother, on the other hand, drew the farm. He's more concerned with the outdoors. It's stereotypic to say the domain of men is the outside, while the domain of women is the house, but it very much is that way. Those domains are somewhat porous. Women help outside, men help in the kitchen. But for the most part, each of these children has drawn the world that they will come to occupy and be responsible for.
And I want to go back to the coloring book for just a moment, Karen, because when you and I had a conversation about this earlier, not only is there expectation that they will color neatly and not scribble, but if they do scribble and they're making a mess of the coloring book, it will actually be taken away from them. It's not tolerated, actually.
I mean, we've all seen little kids, you know, a 2-year-old takes the crayon and scribbles on the page, and we all go, "Oh, isn't that cute?" An Amish child will not be allowed to do that. That's considered ruining the book, and they have to learn to have respect for the book. So by the time they're very young, they're doing very sophisticated coloring, and coloring is an activity that Amish enjoy at all stages of life.
So a lot of questions tend to come up about the perception of this division of roles according to gender, which starts very early, clearly, by what you learn to do from your elders. One of the things that you have helped me understand over time is that within the Amish culture, it's not perceived that one is better than the other or that one is less than, that they each have their roles and there's worthiness and respect in that. So can you speak a little bit more about the gender division of labor and how they understand it?
Well, that's basically it. God created man and woman, and they're different. They have their own role to play. One is not better than the other. In Christ's church, there is no male or female. But submission is key in the Amish world. There's a divine hierarchy that places God over all, but man over woman, older over younger. And we tend to, looking at it from the outside, submission, in researching the lives of Amish women, submission is everything. It was key for me to understand this, and I kept learning more about it. The Amish talk about submission, that women must, women are submissive to their husbands, and husbands are submissive to God. But the Amish emphasize that men are submissive too, that while women submit to men, men have responsibilities because of that submission. So it's not the kind of, it's not like, men are all powerful and can do whatever they want and women have to submit. Not by any stretch of the imagination, because part of being submissive to God means that you have to care for the women in your life, that they are extremely important, that you can't be a Christian without valuing women. And women, they've got this submission, but that doesn't mean they're downtrodden and beholden. Now, what I found was that depending on the kind of community, and in this book, I've broadly grouped Amish churches. And let me just step back a minute to say there are roughly 40 different kinds of Amish. And I've just mentioned a few. We have Schwarzentrugers. There's the Swiss Amish, like you see in Norfolk. There are Troyer Amish that have just come to the North Country. You have Old Order. You've got Byler Amish with the brown buggies. Within the 40 different rough affiliations of Amish, you've got all sorts of variations in between. I grouped in this book, I grouped them into 3 general categories. The very conservative, the agricultural Amish. These are folks who are determined to stay farming. For them, being farmers is the lifestyle most conducive to being Christian in the Amish way. These would include Schwarzentrugers. It includes the Norfolk people. When it gets hard to make a living by farming, you move somewhere so that you can buy more land, and you set up a new community. So you have Amish now leaving Hubleton to, they've moved into Lafargeville. They moved out to Black River. They're now on the other side of Gouverneur. You have a new settlement going in Argyle, down closer to Albany. You have Schwarzentrugers settling in Westport. They've moved into Prince Edward Island, Canada, and into Maine. Farming is key. And so you move so that you and your children can keep farming. In Lancaster County, for example, there they haven't kept farming for the most part. What they've become is what I call entrepreneurial. When it got hard to make a living on a farm, well, you went into business. And women, as well as men, have been establishing businesses. Some of them very, very large businesses, some with an internet presence and a web page and everything else. A third way to go was what happened in a number of large communities out in the Midwest. Men went off to do factory work. Women who were married and had children couldn't go into the factories. They became stay-at-home mothers. And what I began to see as I researched these three broad paths in the Amish world was that submission had come to mean something different for these different kinds of Amish. When I would ask agricultural Amish about what submission meant, I'd ask women, what does it mean to be submissive? And they all began a narrative of needing to talk to each other, that only one person, ultimately somebody has to decide, and ultimately that's going to be the man. But a man who must be submissive as well is going to listen to his wife. And she can talk him into things, he can talk her into things, they arrive at a compromise, but submission is about talking. Something similar was going on in entrepreneurial communities. There I had a deacon tell me that, he said, men wear the pants in my community. And then he said, of course, women tell them which pants to put on. And, so that kind of joking, but again, it was about talking. One woman who owns a quilt shop, a giant quilt shop in Lancaster County, I asked her what submission meant. And she said, well, my husband thought I should expand the quilt shop. And I told him I didn't want to do it. That's where she ended. That's what submission meant to her. Her husband gave his opinion. She thought about it and decided against it. It's a very different thing out in wage labor communities where you have husbands off working and there's a lot of disposable income. They're not farming. Women are preserving food by freezing it more often than canning it. So there's not a lot of chores to keep the kids busy in the same way. And because husband and maybe unmarried daughters, unmarried kids are going into the English world and working, they're in the hospitality trade, they're working as clerks, they're in stores, they're on factory lines. The one place where the Amish don't interact with English is in the home. And women have become very responsible for keeping the purity of the home, which is where you welcome church. And as part of this new role they have as stay-at-home moms, as keepers of home, women have become very submissive in much more of their lives, and a submission more like what we think of as submission, with the understanding that if we are submissive in this way, we can have a positive impact on the others and help them lead lives that will be more likely to earn them salvation. In other words, they've taken responsibility for the spiritual well-being of others, not just for themselves, but for others. And it gives them a kind of authority different from women in other communities. But that means that when we talk about submission, it's not a one-size-fits-all concept.
Right. Right. We have a question here, Karen, from someone who's looking at the colors in the drawing and noting that they seem bright for an Amish home. So she's wondering if those colors reflect what would actually have been found in that little girl's home.
No. And there are colors that wouldn't have been allowed. I mean, certainly in this particular girl's home, there wouldn't have been a rug in front of the stove, for example. There wouldn't be lamps that look red with green. She's using her favorite colors. What she would not get away with doing would be to say, color the horse purple, or to make the dog pink with magenta polka dots. So these are possible colors. They're not the colors of her home. She couldn't color with unrealistic colors. She may well be using some of the colors that she's seen in an English neighbor's house.
Okay, let's move on to the next photograph that we have here. I think people are very fascinated by what teenage Amish do and what they're allowed to do and how that then translates into the adults they become. So this is a photograph that I think would surprise a lot of people, a group of Amish teenagers playing ping pong. So let's talk about Amish teenagers.
The most well-known thing about Amish teenagers is that they have Rumspringa, the running around time. That's probably the most misunderstood period of teenage life. Amish children finish school with 8th grade. So they're roughly about, 13 or 14 when they're no longer going to school. These kids, you've got young ones, and the woman whose back is to us was likely the teacher because she appears older. This picture was taken out at a school in Indiana. It's a much more progressive school. This is the kind of community where fathers would be going off to work in factories. Some of these kids may have jobs after they leave school they may wait tables in a restaurant or so on. When children leave school at the age of, after 8th grade, for most, there's a period that's very quiet. They're at home. They're not with the young folk. Amish teenagers join the young folk when they're 16 or 17, depending on the group. That time that they're at home, they're helping. It's a vocational education that will continue until they're married and starting their own families. They'll be working for mom or for dad. They may be hired out to work for a neighbor, but they're working. And then they're coming home at night and they're at home. So it's a insular period that from 8th grade until the young folk. When they join the young folk, now they're with their peer group. What they can get away with in the young folk again depends on the community. It may be a very quiet kind of young folk where you're having hymn singings every other Sunday night, and a date is being driven home by the fellow you're dating. It may be taking part in a beer blast that's been called together on a moment's notice because you all have cell phones. It can be anywhere in between. So, Amish children have a very, very diverse teenagehood. And I see a couple of questions have come up. That Rumspringa time is when they have to make the two most important decisions of their lives. One is whether or not to join church. Not all Amish young people join church. That is, not all Amish young people are baptized and become Amish. We think of them all as Amish. That infant in a bonnet and a dress is Amish. The teenager is Amish. But for the Amish, they're not yet church members. They're not yet a member of the Amish church until they're baptized. And they have to decide to become baptized. Now, the overwhelming majority do. The range or the percentage of those who leave ranges from maybe 5% to 15%. The more progressive the group, the more porous the lines are between the church community and the English world, and the higher the rate of those who leave. The more conservative the group, the lower the number who leave. More men, more boys leave than women. And people leave for different reasons.
Why?
Yeah, those who leave before they join church are often leaving to get, as the Amish put it, to get more, to have a car, to be able to have a phone, to be able to have the things that they're not permitted in their church. Girls are often leaving, well, as I say, not as many girls leave as boys. Girls may leave if they meet somebody in the non-Amish world and are attracted away for that reason. Married couples often leave if they, basically if they become born again. The Amish believe they have a hope of salvation, but they don't claim to know that they're saved. And when Amish meet those who would proselytize by talking about assurance of salvation, you can know you're saved. It's often a very attractive thing to have this kind of knowledge of salvation. In fact, there's one of the Amish affiliations is called New Order Amish. And they differ from all of the rest of the Amish because they preach that one can have an individual knowledge, this individual relationship with God, and so can know they're saved. Interestingly enough, among the New Order Amish, the rate of leaving is about 40%. Because if you can have this personal knowledge of salvation, you don't really need the church. And so it's easier to leave.
Yeah.
So.
We have another question here, Karen. You talked about Amish working in factories. The question is, what kind of factories do they work in, and are women allowed to work in factories too?
Women can work in factories if they're not married. So an interesting side note to that is that women in this kind of community that we see playing ping pong are often putting off marriage until they're much older because they're busy earning lots of money in the factory.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to get to that. We've had a lot of questions about women having the option not to marry. So we'll get to that.
And meanwhile, let me just say that if you drive an RV, it was probably Amish built, or Amish labor built part of it. They've built interiors for aircraft. They've worked in plastics factories, turning out, picnic cutlery. A variety of different kinds of factory work.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's actually move on to the next slide because a lot of the other questions that are coming up are going to naturally fall here. So this is a shot. This one I think you said was taken in Norfolk, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, this young woman, the blue dress, it's a blue dress and cape and apron that you see on the left side of the picture, was the dress she wore to church when the couple was published. That is, when their engagement was announced. And she made a matching blue shirt for her intended. So when they showed up in church and they were published, which is supposed to come as a big surprise to everybody. Amish keep courting pretty secret, or they try to. Most people know, of course, but so when they showed up and were published, their engagement was announced, they were in matching clothes. The black dress with the white apron and the white cape was her wedding gown. You can see the drawer is pulled open because in that drawer she was keeping favors that she was making for what are called the side sitters, the equivalent of the bridesmaids and the groomsmen. The couple has 4 couples that will sit with them at the wedding dinner, and they're given these special favors that the couple will, if they're very conservative, make themselves. If they're more progressive, purchase. So this bride was very excited.
Yeah, so before we even get to the wedding day, we have lots of questions about women choosing not to get married in the first place. So let's talk about, well, let me just read you some of these questions. I'll read them all to you and then you can tackle this, and it's 3 questions.
Okay.
Can Amish women choose not to marry or not to have children? Since singlehood is mostly a female situation, why are single women called girls? And it's surprising the Amish don't have specific roles for single or widowed women. And is it true that Amish men are alone in selecting who he decides to court? Do the women have a say except to accept or decline a man's offer?
There is, as you might expect, a lot of, hey, is your sister seeing anybody kinds of things going on, and a lot of leading people to other people. In fact, the side sitters that I mentioned, just as sometimes English couples might try and match up their friends and who they choose to be bridesmaids and groomsmen, Amish couples are doing the same thing. Courtship is something private between the young man and the young woman. Often no one knows who's courting whom. It's kept secret. It's only if it's getting serious that parents might start to say something, especially if they would see a daughter dating someone they didn't see was appropriate, or seeing a son dating a daughter or dating a girl they didn't think was appropriate. Dating is looking for a mate. So any Amish individual who dates a lot is showing that they're really not worthy of spousal material. You're really looking to settle down. That's that second big decision of Rumspringa. You're going to join, if you're going to join church, and who are you going to marry and settle down with? Women are raised to expect marriage. It doesn't mean all of them want it or all of them get married. It's their choice. They're not obliged to accept anybody. I knew one woman who got married very late. She was in her 50s, and her siblings all said, "What is she doing? Why is she getting married?" You know, especially since at one fell swoop she acquired 11 children and 4 grandchildren. So it is, the onus is on the man to ask, which means it's very difficult for a man to remain single. But no woman has to accept, so it's much easier for a woman to remain single. And single women in more progressive communities may have a career teaching. They may continue to work if they're able to work for the English, then they may continue to do that. They will likely live on their own. They will perhaps sew for siblings, have a business. So you know, they can pretty much do whatever they want as single women. They also get invited to a lot more events. I know one single woman who's invited to every wedding, and consequently the young couple that live in the main house, she lives in a small house attached to the main house, they go to a lot of weddings because they take her. So if they get married, they expect to have children. This does not mean there's no birth control in use in Amish communities. I'm sure it's in use in all Amish communities. It would be against the ordinum, and so no one would ever talk about using birth control. It's expected that there will be children. If there are not children, then women are sad, but it's God's will. And so key for the Amish, and part of the submission that we talked about, is accepting God's will for your life. So, you know, if you marry and you don't have children, that's God's will for your life. And you will be very sad, but you will, you know, you may help with the siblings' children, or so on. Talking to Amish women who were single about being single, a number of them expressed the sentiment that it was better to remain single than to have a bad marriage. And so, you know, there's that to the thinking as well.
Right. Okay. All right. So now let's go back to the wedding. We've got a young married couple. What would be typical of a young married woman's life? What would her priorities be?
Well, the wedding is the big thing. The wedding takes place generally about 10 days after you get published. So I mean, that's not true in all communities. There are large communities where, brides have to sort of plan their wedding around the fact that there are going to be lots of people getting married at the same time. Different communities have different wedding traditions. The Schwarzentroopers' weddings tend to take place in wintertime, simply because without refrigeration, that's the best way to keep food cold. In Lancaster County, the traditional wedding period was the fall. That's now spread into spring simply because there are too many people to cram them all in. So each community has its own wedding traditions. The bride and groom after the wedding will have to clean up from their wedding. They've got to get all the dishes washed. They've got to get borrowed dishes back to those they borrowed them from. They will start their married life by going around and visiting different people, particularly those who were unable to come to the wedding. And then they will, probably after maybe up to a month, living with the bride's folks. It's the bride's family hosts the wedding, so they'll stay with the bride's folks. They will move into their new home. For many Amish couples, especially in areas like this, the new home may be what's called a skid house, a small temporary home, even on an estate of an English farmer. And the husband will go to work for the farmer to raise money with the goal of buying a farm of their own. And the bride starts in doing what she's been doing all her life. She's handling the house, she's sewing clothes, she's preparing meals, she's starting a garden, she's preserving food. And ideally, the Amish thing, the general thinking is, within the year, she'll be nursing a baby. Mm-hmm. It's easy for Amish young people in a sense. They can only marry someone that is in a church with the same or similar ordinum. They may be in two different church communities or congregations, but if the community's fellowship, that is, if their ordinums are similar enough, then they can get married. So right away, you're marrying someone who has grown up in exactly the same kind of setting as you have, with exactly the same kind of expectations, exactly the same kinds of traditions, eating the same kind of meals, following the same kind of seasonal routine. And that makes it a little easier starting off married life. You don't have the kinds of arguments about, my mother made this better than you did. Why can't you make it my mother's way? Because mother and bride are making things the same way.
Right.
It's a little more difficult the more progressive you get because families aren't as standardized. So.
And we did have a question earlier about different groups of Amish interacting. So since you've led us to that discussion, could you elaborate a little bit about which groups of Amish would interact generally with other groups, not necessarily to marry, but would interact in a social way?
All Amish will interact. If you go to an Amish auction, you're going to see all different kinds of Amish and probably a few Mennonites too. So there's social interaction. They may come and contribute to a barn raising. If there's a funeral, you'll see different kinds of Amish. You may even see different kinds of Amish at a wedding if some family members have joined a different church than others. So all Amish interact. They all recognize each other as Amish. But it's church, it's the religious functions, it's marriage. Those are restricted. The interaction is restricted to Amish who are in fellowship with each other. If two communities are in fellowship with each other, then ministers of one can preach at services of the other. Young people can marry back and forth. If they're not in fellowship, there will only be such social interaction as rubbing elbows at an auction or that kind of thing. And it's hard to tell. For example, in the Hewelton area, there are 4 different kinds of Schwarzentroopers that are not in fellowship with each other. And unless you know the families and which community they're in, you don't know if they're in fellowship with someone else. And in fact, I know a couple, and they're in a different church. They don't fellowship with their parents. Now they're back and forth all the time because they're daughters who, the daughter goes and sees her parents all the time, but they're not in the same church. So fellowshipping really determines who you will marry, who you will worship with. And for socializing, fine.
Yeah, and there's another related question to this. Well, and at least in my mind, it is in this discussion of fellowship, that at the period when a teenager decides whether to become Amish, to get baptized, to join the church, there's the possibility that they will not. And then there's the whole question of shunning and the family shunning and what kind of interaction they have. So the question we have about that is, can you explain the difference between shunning and excommunication? And what happens if a mother can't bear to shun her child?
She's got a problem, depending on the group. Shunning is really the outcome of excommunication. In Pennsylvania Dutch, that's called the ban. And basically, if you're baptized, you make a vow to God to uphold the ordinum, to practice your faith is defined by the ordinum of the community. If you go against the ordinum, if and depending on the community, because each community sort of sets what it will take to get you excommunicated. If you go against the ordinum, people will come and they'll visit you and they'll caution you to see the error of your ways and to change your behavior. And if in fact you refuse to do that, then the church will excommunicate you. It will put you out. And the result of being excommunicated is that you are shunned. Now, if someone feels great guilt that they've broken the ordinum, they may go to the church and put themselves in bond and make themselves shunned as a way of repenting. But once you're in bond, you are shunned, and that may mean that you're no longer welcome in the house. You're not welcome to visit. Go away. For more progressive groups, it may mean that they won't eat with you or they won't serve you at the same table. So it's a whole range of behaviors depending on the kind of Amish that you are. The hope is that the person who's been shunned will see the error of his or her ways and come and make confession to church, at which point they'll be taken back into the congregation, and that's that. So it's a kind of community tough love. And I know young men who have left and then returned to the church. I knew a bishop that had been shunned in his early days. He joined the Air Force, got out of the service, came back to the church. They called him Jet Mose or Air Force Mose. Married, had a family, and was back in the church. So the hope is that excommunication will get you back on the right path. Shunning is a necessary outcome because you've broken your promise to God to follow the ordinum. Others in the church community have made that same promise. And if they don't excommunicate you, they'd be breaking their promise themselves. So when you violate the ordinum, you know that that's an outcome because the rest can't do anything but shun you, or they would be breaking the ordinum. The only time one can leave the church, as a church member can leave the church without being shunned, is if a split is happening in the church. And as I said, there are 4 different kinds of Schwarzentrubers. There weren't 36 years ago. There was only one kind. So there have been a number of splits in the church. And it may be that, some practices come in, some bit of equipment has come in, and the church is divided on whether to accept it. Now, if everybody just starts using it, and nobody raises a fuss, well, then it's there. But if there's dissension about whether that new thing is acceptable in the church, if there are ministers on both sides of the discussion and they can't find a compromise, then the groups agree to go their own way. And they become two different kinds of Amish, no longer in fellowship. Now, until each group begins holding church services, probably about 2 weeks after the split, you can do anything. As one Amish person said, we can even leave and be like you because of the split. It's like this steam vent that releases pressure. And so you can go and do anything. You can join any kind of Amish, you can be English, and you will never be under bond.
But to go back to the mother who can't bear to shun her child, if she chose not to honor that commitment that she has to shun her child, she herself would have to leave, right? Exactly, she herself would be shunned.
That's exactly right.
Right.
So it's heartbreaking, because if you break a vow to God, I mean, it's one thing to leave the community before you're baptized and go off and be English. And parents will fear for, they're going to fear for your eternal soul. But if you break a promise you made to God and then leave, that's pretty sure that you have doomed yourself eternally. I mean, how can you break a promise to God?
And what is the typical age of baptism? That's another question that we have here in the chat.
It's roughly about 18.
18. Okay.
Yeah, roughly about 18. You need to be old enough to know the seriousness of your action. And if the bishops think you're not mature enough to make that decision, they will advise you not to be baptized.
Okay, well, let's move on. We have just a couple of photographs left, and we've had some questions about, women, Amish women working outside the home, earning income, how that's controlled. So this is obviously a bakery stand here that's owned by, I'm assuming owned and run by Amish women?
It may be a family business that's hiring women from the community to work as well. I would suspect that it says Kaufman farm market. I would suspect that this is a family business. They may have a daughter-in-law working. They may have hired someone from the community. This is down in Lancaster. You can see these are Lancaster Amish from their caps. Women in every single kind of Amish earn money. Now, in the wage labor, once they marry, they no longer are working outside the home. They may be making quilts and selling them. They may do something like that. But in every other kind of community, there are farm stands. Those are run by women. Businesses run by women. If you go to Lancaster, you can see, B&Bs run by women, quilt stores, market stores, all different kinds. There are no restrictions on women earning money. There are restrictions on when women can leave the community to work and who they can work for. But there are no restrictions on women earning money, and they can own the kind of business they like to own. One Amish woman told me that it was more common to see women starting businesses, baking or sewing, or a tailor business, or a bookshop, or a notion store, or like a bulk food store, because those are things women were more familiar with. But she said, if they like to work in the shop, a woman can start a shop. And, I certainly know women who have worked in shops, with their husbands, helping build things. And I know one woman who loves to sand the furniture her husband makes. So they're really in the business together.
So related to this, we have a question. The question is, it seems that some Amish women have more financial responsibilities than others. Is it common for Amish wives to share responsibilities with their husbands or not? And I think what that question is getting at, do they have shared obligation to the income of the household? And how is that money kind of managed between husband and wife?
They're supposed to be a couple, which means they work together. And as one Schwarzentruber woman told me about her son who had just gotten married, she told me he wants to get into carpentry. If he can't get on his feet right away, his wife is going to have to bake or sell clothes. So the understanding is you're in it together. You do things together, you make decisions together. And, before any big purchase, they're going to talk about it together. That's less true in those kinds of wage labor communities where, of course, it's the husband's paycheck that the family is living on, and the husband has control of the pocketbook. In places like Lancaster, among the entrepreneurial communities, women will often talk about their businesses as family businesses, even though husbands have nothing to do with it. There is the understanding that both are contributing to the family and that the income is both their income.
And so in terms of discretionary purchases, is there generally an understanding that each of them gets some money to spend as they wish, or like how would that be negotiated?
If they need something, they get it. If they need something and they know they can afford it, they can get it. I don't think either husband or wife in any community would just go out and make a major purchase without time. That would be frowned on. They're going to talk about selling the farm. They're going to talk about, if the husband thinks he needs a big piece of equipment for the farm, he'll talk it over with his wife. If the wife wants to, get a new sewing machine, she'll talk it over. And then, and then they work it out together. That's that submission again. You talk it over. But the understanding is the couple is a unit, and they work together.
We have a question about where the Amish keep their money. Do they use regular commercial financial institutions? They keep it in a bank, in a savings account?
Yep, or credit unions. That's gotten a lot more difficult for some because, not all Amish will get Social Security numbers. There's, a photo ID is difficult for Amish folks who don't want their pictures taken. But they're keeping it in banks and credit unions.
Okay, but they wouldn't be investing in the stock market?
No. I say that, but there are limits to, you can never say anything that's absolutely true for all Amish. There are some very wealthy communities, and there are some very, very wealthy Amish. It's said, for example, that most of the rental property in Lancaster City is Amish owned. They'll buy decrepit old buildings, an Amish carpentry crew goes in and rehabs them, and then they rent it out. So there's that kind of investment.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay. Jane, I'm going to get to your questions when we move on to the next photo. But in terms of thinking about income, women earning income, is there any aspect of that we haven't covered that you want to say anything else about, Karen?
I think I saw a question asking if there were limits on how commercial an enterprise could be. And they're different from community to community. Anything that would take the Amish, for example, years ago, there was a furniture maker, and his shop was just getting too big. It was Dad wasn't finding time to come be home at meal times with the family. There was more work than the family could handle. So the father took down his sign and put up one advertising his little boy's, worm business. So instead of furniture or cabinets, you had worms, 3 cents. That was a while ago. Worms are now 6 cents. Women's businesses are expected to be at home. So I interviewed one woman who, her popcorn business retails internationally. She's got a website and everything else. And she told me that the one thing she feared was that the business would get too big to operate out of the basement of their house. Mm-hmm. Her husband had a construction business in the garage next to the house. And I asked her, I said, if it got too big, she said, well, then I'd have to cut back. So the limits are community limits, and they challenge the community. I mean, you've got to stay within the ordinum. You don't want your business to take you away from church practice, and that challenges the ordinum too, because there are those who'd like to make lots of money.
Okay, let's move on to the next image then, because that will bring us to some of the other questions. So before we speak about this specific woman that we're looking at and sort of the later stage of life, we have a question about whether or not women who are widowed are allowed to remarry.
Sure. Yes, there's been a study done of second marriages. There is no divorce in the Amish world. So that's completely off the table. If you're a woman and let's say your spouse leaves the Amish and is in bond, you can never marry again. They're called grass widows. Their husbands are on the wrong side of the grass. If they were true widows, they could marry again. There are those who marry young. There was an accident a couple years back where a young man was killed. The wife is remarried. And you can marry for companionship later in life. So yes.
All right, so let's talk about a later stage of a woman's life in the Amish community and what might happen after she's raised her children, possibly she's widowed and choosing not to remarry. What are some of the options at that stage?
Well, it depends on what kind of group she's with. If she's widowed, chooses not to remarry, she will probably live in a dotty house close to one of her children. A dotty house is a small house built onto the back or side of a larger, the main family home. Often when the last of the children are marrying, couples will hold a big auction, sell all their stuff, build a dotty house, and sell the farm to one of their children. And then if let's say her husband passes away, she'll stay in the dotty house. And when she is no longer able to take care of herself, one of her grandchildren will probably be there all the time to run errands for her. If she's no longer able to cook for herself, she'll be taken into the main house and we'll have meals with the family living there. So she's always taken care of by her family. She's independent until she can't be anymore. So, like this woman, she may be doing all sorts of things in the community. This woman clearly is a much more progressive Amish woman. She's got a Lancaster type hat. And she may be visiting the Amish retirement community in Pinecraft, Florida, which is where many of the most progressive Amish go to get away from winter. All these Amish snowbirds. And that speaks to a kind of Amish where grandparents aren't needed anymore to help with farm chores, to help with new grandchildren. So there's a whole range of activities that older people are involved in.
So we have a question about that. The question is, could you explain the concept of helpmeets and why widows without children can't serve in that role? And how is the role of an older woman different if she doesn't have children?
Well, if she doesn't have children, then she really has a hard time because she will probably rely much more on nieces and nephews and their children, who she'll probably live in a house close to one of her nieces and nephews. The helpmeet, if your spouse is gone, who will you help meet to? She will, the widow will continue to do whatever she can to help children and grandchildren. At weddings, she'll be asked to be a cook, which is an important role in an Amish wedding because you're making the meal for hundreds of people. She will be invited to, different kinds of activities in the church community. Because as long as she can work, she's helpful. And she may remarry. I'm not sure if that answers that question, but.
And could you just define helpmeet? What does that term mean, actually?
The helpmeet is as the Amish see it, and it's not a term that they themselves use very often. The helpmeet is the spouse, the wife, the helper, and it sort of captures that what we think of as the subordinate position in a patriarchal society. But I want to suggest that the Amish have a soft patriarchy, let's say, where both men and women are submissive both to each other and to God, and have their own roles to play. Mm-hmm. So helpmeet would be the wife.
Yeah, and I want to go back to you talking about an elderly couple or a widow selling the farm to the children. It would not be very common for them to just give the farm to the kids, right? Because their retirement income is coming from the sale of their farm.
That's right. And you want to do it. You want to get your dotty house built before your youngest child comes of age, which in the Amish world is 21. Particularly in the most conservative communities, children turn their earnings over to their parents. So a 15-year-old boy working in a sawmill for his neighbor gets paid a wage that he then brings home and turns over to mom and dad, who may give him some spending money. But Amish thinking is he lives at home, he has responsibilities to the family. When he comes of age, then he has to pay for his own clothes and medical care and everything else. But the family has to pay him for any work he does for the family. So you want to get the dotty house built while children still owe you their labor. And then there are variations on this thing too that I can talk about. So, the couple moves into the dotty house, and they support themselves in their old age because they don't have pensions, they don't collect Social Security. All they have to live on is what they've accumulated throughout their lives and the earnings they can still make. And part of that income is the farm and the equipment and the furniture and everything else. So they'll hold a big auction and hopefully make lots of money that they then bank and live on.
Right. Okay, I'd like to take some time to answer some general questions that have come throughout. So let me try to go through those. There was a question earlier about whether or not an English person, a non-Amish person, can ever attend an Amish wedding, and asking whether presumably you have done so. So
I've attended lots of Amish weddings. Yeah, they're lots of fun, and I eat well. It's up to the bride's family. The bride's family chooses who to invite. The groom gets to have his immediate family, and his unmarried siblings will be there. Some of his married, siblings his married sisters may be asked to be cooks. But it's really up to the bride if and her family if they invite you. And some Amish simply don't want to have English there. It's they would feel uncomfortable or would worry that family members would feel uncomfortable. But I've been to a number of Amish weddings, different kinds of Amish weddings, and they're fun. You eat very well.
Yeah,
that's really what it is. The wedding itself is this little 15-minute to half-hour part of a 3-hour church service, and then everybody comes home for dinner. And after dinner, men will sing, the cooks will clean up, women will sit around and talk, children will be outside playing, then there's supper. Then everybody goes home except for the young people who party into the night and have snacks until well past midnight. And then everybody has to get up at like 5 in the morning to do chores and start cleanup. So I've been there for the dinner and the supper. Not being a young folk, I don't get to take part in that.
If one family in a community is struggling, or I should say within the church is struggling, do the other families in that church have an obligation to help them?
Yes, yes. And if let's say the family is having terrible money troubles, the church may appoint a sort of guardianship, or 2 or 3 people who are doing very well, who will help that couple manage things. If a family is weighed under with medical bills, others in the church community will contribute to help pay for that. They won't do it all. The understanding is people should really be responsible for themselves, but they understand that there are times when families get into hot water, and so they work together to help them. If there is illness, they will be there to help the family.
So related to that, how do families deal with members that have disabilities within the Amish world?
They're kept at home. I mean, much depends on the nature of the disability. I know families with children with Down syndrome who, have chores and are expected to help as much as they can, as much as, to their ability. I know a family that had a child in a wheelchair. He was brought to every activity. He was there. He couldn't do very much. He had severe disabilities, but he was there. Other families that have had children born with catastrophic birth defects, and the child is always there in the middle of the family. And just as when elderly parents can no longer take care of themselves and the family brings them into the home and takes care of them, children who are born and unable to take care of themselves are cared for by the family. It's believed, part of giving up, part of that yielding, that submission, is believing that God's will, and if God doesn't send us more than we can handle, and this is what God has sent us. And having known parents of severely disabled children, several of whom have lost those children when they were not very old, to a person, they talk about missing that child and the joy of taking care of that child, and that child bringing others together around that child in its care. So
we also have a question about whether or not non-Amish, the English, can join Amish communities. If so, how do you do that, and is it common?
It's not common. It can be done. A key figure in my research was a man who graduated from Notre Dame, had been destined for the priesthood, met some Amish while selling encyclopedias, moved to an Amish community, married an Amish woman, and spent the rest of his life being Amish. It's not easy. First of all, life is in Pennsylvania Dutch. You have to learn the language. You have to, learn to get along without many of the things that we take for granted. It's very difficult because in the English world, we prize individualism. The Amish world prizes consensus, giving up, submitting. And so, you may think your idea is the best thing since sliced bread, but if the rest of the community isn't interested, then you give it up. And that's very difficult for English people. In addition, Amish faith, it's a lived faith, but it's a lived faith in hopes of salvation. And many who want to convert to Amishness or find themselves more at ease in plain churches that also teach assurance of salvation. So the higher the church and the more they would preach assurance of salvation, the more likely they are more likely a convert is to succeed. So, but it has been done. People have joined the Amish church. It's not.
So one other question, a general question that's coming, actually, there are two more general questions, and then I'll just see if anybody else has anything they want to know. In cases of impropriety, people doing things within the community that are illegal or evidence of mental illness or things where normally there would be outside authorities who get involved, is that handled within the Amish community, or do outside forces come in, like social services or police or anything like that?
That's a difficult question. The Amish will try to handle it, but they're not very adept at handling it. Key among the Amish is that you forgive. Just, you're following Christ's example. Christ forgives. So to be worthy of salvation, we must forgive those who hurt us in any way. So the Amish prefer to handle wrongdoing within the community by having the person confess, and the community forgives them, and then you move on. And that doesn't work with abuse, for example. If you've got someone who's abused children, forgiving them and moving on simply doesn't work. But it also doesn't work very well for the Amish to have social services come in and take the wrongdoer away, to move the children from the home. Those things the community finds work very much against their understanding of the church and of faith and parental responsibility and all of that. So what usually happens is a mess that, where nothing is resolved well. And there are a number of people who've become very adept at a Mennonite organization now that's spending a lot of time working with old order communities on issues of spousal and child abuse. So they try, they do it poorly, social services gets involved, and that's that. If Amish break the law in other ways, let's say they're out racing their buggies and drunk, and they get picked up for drunk and disorderly, or they're in groups where they're in the young folk, and let's say they're driving a car, because that will often happen in more progressive groups, and they get arrested for DUI. Cops get involved. Parents try to support children. I mean, it's very similar, I would think, in our world, where parents would try to support the children. But it's understood that they will not hire lawyers. They will accept help from a defense attorney, but they're not going to sue. They're not going to go out and hire a lawyer. And, after that young person has paid the penalty, they come back to the community, beg for forgiveness, and hopefully have learned their ways. I mean, those aren't great answers, but, there are no easy answers for that question.
Yeah. Going back to the grass widows, the husband who's left, presumably he would be shunned by the community, right? So Absolutely. Does he have the option to remarry because he's left the church?
Because he's left the church, and it may happen that he gets divorced and remarries, and there have been horrible custody cases. It's not easy for a child to spend a week with Amish mom and a week with non-Amish dad and grow up Amish. But the spouse that leaves can do whatever they want because they're not Amish. They're certainly shunned. Now, if they would choose to return to the Amish, that second marriage would not be recognized. So there would be problems there. There was a case, this is going back to the convert question, there was a case of a couple who wished very much to join the Amish and were living an Amish lifestyle, but were not ever permitted to join them because each of them had divorced and remarried each other. And the church simply couldn't recognize their marriage. Each would have been allowed to join church separately, but then what do you do with those children they have? So it was an issue. They were not allowed to join church.
Okay. So we have covered a lot of territory here. This has been wonderful and informative, and I really appreciate all the questions. Does anybody have a final question? There is one final general question I'll end with, but I want to give everybody who's still here an opportunity. If you haven't heard the answer to something that has still been in your mind, are there any final questions? Is there anybody who's dying to say something directly to Karen? If so, now would be the time to unmute yourself and say something right to Karen directly.
Hi, Mom.
Hey, dear. Let me introduce my research partner for most of my research time, my daughter, Miriam.
Hi, Miriam.
I miss very, very much.
And Jen is saying this has been super interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One final question. Some Amish women seem more willing to talk with the English than others. And we know that English is the term that the Amish use to pretty much refer to all non-Amish people. What should one expect if you don't already have friendships, relationships with the Amish, and you're going to go stop by one of their farms or something? What should you expect about reception and maybe the appropriate way for you to approach?
Well, I would recommend stopping by farm stands, not just going up to a farm unless they've got a sign advertising something for sale. And, you know, your reception, personality matters. You know, they're just going to be outgoing women and not so outgoing women. I wouldn't be too pushy and start asking lots and lots of questions. But, you know, I began my research just by going back and talking more each time and getting to know people. You know, playing with the kids, asking what the word for something is. But your reception will depend very much on, you know, if you've got a busy mother with 8 kids under the age of 9, she probably is going to get very frustrated that you're holding her up. On the other hand, if you have an older woman with time on her hands, she might be interested in talking to you. So it really, it's a crapshoot. What can I say?
Yeah. Well, this is wonderful, Karen. Thank you. And I want to remind everyone again that if you enjoyed this program and you'd like to see other programs like this, you can go to the link that Shuka provided in the chat and make a donation, $5, something like that, to put towards another program. If you don't have Karen's books yet, I hope you'll get copies of her books because they're wonderfully informative and they're wonderfully written, and you will learn so much about our neighbors who are increasing in numbers all the time. There are more and more Amish neighbors all throughout our North Country all the time. So I think it's important for us to understand something about their culture and the differences between different communities and so forth. So thank you very much, Karen, for being with us tonight.
Again, I'm thank you. Thank you for coming and listening to me go on. And again, if you have any questions before we sign off, please don't hesitate to ask.
Yeah, Karen, this is Sue Klein. I just want to tell people, oh, good. I love the book. It was really very informative. I had a lot of questions. She asked a lot of my questions in advance. I'm really worried about the grass widows, you know, because that's not fair. That's just not fair. But anyway, I want to tell people if they really want to see the Amish, go to Burke. They have this wonderful auction every spring. I don't know when it's coming up soon. And it's wonderful. They've got quilts people can see from, I mean, not everybody there made them. They have furniture, you know, it's an equipment auction. So there's a lot of men, but different aspects of Amish. You get to see a whole spectrum.
You get to see a lot of different folks. Burke is it's a much more progressive community if you've only seen Shorts and Troopers.
No, but people come from all over the country there.
Oh yeah. And there will be auctions coming up this spring, summer, and fall out in Hewelton, and they'll have Burke auctioneers.
Oh, they are so interesting.
They're
pushy. Come on, you know. Yeah,
you can spend lots of money.
Oh yeah, I spent a lot of money on the quilts. Thank you. Thank you so much, Karen, for writing and all this information for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue.
Okay, well, stay tuned for other live events. We're going to be doing at least one live event a month. If you want to stay in touch with what we're doing, follow us in social media at the Tawny Center in Facebook and on Instagram. You can also subscribe to our e-newsletter, which comes out twice a month. And then you will always know exactly what's coming up. We do a wide range of activities related to all different kinds of topics. If there's a particular subject you're really interested in that you'd like us to have a future event about, please write to us. So if you want to subscribe to the e-newsletter, write to shuka@tawny.org. And if you have an idea for an upcoming live event, some topic you'd love us to present, you can write to me, jill@tawny.org. And I hope we'll see you at future events. And I hope very soon some in-person events. We're hoping that by the fall we can start doing some in-person events again. So lovely to be with you all tonight.
Thank you, everybody.
We'll hope to see you again soon. So bye, everyone. Good night.
Have a good night.
Thank you, everybody.